Justice Sonia Sotomayor and revealed a multi-million-dollar secret hidden behind university walls. Within just 48 hours, the story spread across America. Mandatory book sales, hidden contracts, and the buying of justice. As millions held their breath, the Supreme Court's 230-year-old armor shattered, and the legend of untouchable integrity collapsed. What happens when one woman refuses to stay silent and forces an entire nation to confront its darkest truths? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The morning air in Washington, D.C. was razor sharp, colder than it should have been for early fall. A biting wind scraping down the marble facades of government buildings, carrying with it the taste of something electric, something about to break. Office workers shuffled into lobbies with collars turned up and heads ducked low. But the real storm was already spreading, silent and invisible, through the glowing rectangles in their palms. The New York Times had dropped a bombshell just before dawn. Justice Sotomayor's team pressured universities to buy thousands of her books. The headline blazed across phones, laptops, TV screens. Short, brutal, impossible to ignore. Within minutes, the details followed like aftershocks. Dozens of universities, some struggling with budget cuts, had been pressured into buying massive bulk orders of Sonia Sotomayor's memoirs just to secure her appearance at their events. Purchases sometimes totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single engagement. Emails and internal memos, cold and undeniable, exposed university administrators bargaining in private, negotiating numbers like merchants, haggling over wares, not educators inviting a symbol of justice. In the cafes on the metro outside the Capitol, people read and reread the words, the realization creeping in. The woman entrusted with interpreting the Constitution might have been selling her presence like a commodity to the highest bidder. Across the nation, anchors interrupted morning broadcasts, pushing aside international crises to focus on this. A scandal that struck not just at money, but at the fragile idea that somewhere, someone was supposed to be above all of it. In offices and kitchens and lecture halls, a new question caught fire. If even the Supreme Court could be bought and sold, what was left that couldn't? But scandals like this, once unleashed, do not politely knock at the doors of power. They kick them open, demanding blood. The pressure did not simply mount. It suffocated Washington, seeping into every crevice of power like smoke before a firestorm. Across cable news channels and morning papers, the question repeated itself like a war drum. Would Congress dare to confront the untouchables? Under the unbearable weight of public anger, the House Oversight Committee, once reluctant, now cornered, moved with rare speed. In a hurried but unanimous vote, they announced an extraordinary measure, a special congressional hearing aimed directly at the financial conduct of Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Such a move was not only unusual, it was historic, a crack forming in the very granite of American judicial authority. The announcement sent tremors through the political elite, unsettling alliances, igniting fear among those who had always assumed robes came with immunity. Leading this charged investigation was none other than Representative Jasmine Crockett, a woman whose mere presence promised that this hearing would not be a quiet affair. A former civil rights litigator with a voice that could slice through even the thickest obfuscations, Crockett had made a career of refusing to bow before wealth, status, or tradition. Her appointment was a message in itself. This would be no mere ceremony. It would be a reckoning. Summonses bearing the weight of congressional authority were delivered to Justice Sotomayor and members of her administrative staff, each letter as heavy as a verdict before trial. The media seized upon the announcement, splashing Crockett's name alongside Sotomayor's across screens and front pages with the urgency of a nation teetering on the edge. In living rooms, coffee shops, and office corridors, people whispered not about whether the hearing would change anything, but about how deep the rot might go. Even inside the Capitol's marble halls, usually so insulated from the outside world, a new tension took root, a buzzing, unseen force pressing against the walls. For the first time in living memory, a sitting justice would be forced to face the nation not as a distant figure in black robes, but as a citizen accountable to the same laws she once stood above. The old shields of tradition and reverence would not save her here. Under Jasmine Crockett's unflinching gaze, only the truth would matter. And the truth, like blood in the water, had already begun to draw the sharks. The capital, usually a fortress of rituals and whispers, now braced itself like a ship before a storm it could no longer outrun. By dawn, the steps of the Capitol were already heaving with bodies, reporters jostling for position, their camera lenses gleaming like the eyes of restless predators. Protesters surged at the barricades, waving signs that screamed everything from "Justice for sale" to "Defend the court," in a cacophony of rage and betrayal. Every major news network had stationed vans along the perimeter, their satellite dishes spinning hungrily toward the gray sky. Police in dark uniforms formed human walls, their hands resting tensely on their belts. But even they seemed to understand they were only delaying the inevitable. Inside, the air was thick and metallic, buzzing with the anticipation of something irreversible about to unfold. Then, through a secured side entrance, Justice Sonia Sotomayor arrived, wrapped in a sweeping black coat that seemed to repel the noise around her like a shield. Her face was carved in stone, every line arranged in perfect serenity, her eyes scanning the crowd without recognition or fear, as if she were a queen above the battlefield. The cameras exploded in flashes, drowning her in a blizzard of artificial light, but she did not flinch. Without a word, without a smile, she disappeared into the building's marble mouth, leaving behind a crowd that grew only more restless at the scent of power, walking untouchable among them. Inside the hearing chamber, the tension was no less brutal. The walls themselves seemed to tighten, as if recoiling from the weight of the moment. Every seat in the gallery was filled, every aisle lined with more press than had ever gathered for any session short of impeachment. A low, pulsing murmur ran through the room, too quiet to be conversation, too restless to be ignored. The collective breath of a nation holding itself still. At the heart of it all, two chairs faced each other across a long oak table, polished to a mirror's cruelty. One reserved for the justice, the other for the congresswoman. One represented the weight of centuries of law, the other the raw nerve of a people unwilling to be silent anymore. When Jasmine Crockett entered, her stride steady, her expression carved from granite, the entire chamber felt the shift. No gavel had struck, but the battle had already begun. It was not a clash of titles or even of reputations. It was the collision of two Americas, and only one would walk away unshaken. In a room straining under the weight of unspoken accusations, it took only a single sheet of paper, one undeniable fact, to shift the balance from silence to something far more dangerous. Jasmine Crockett, with a patience that felt almost surgical, lifted a single page from the thick folder, holding it between two fingers as if it might contaminate her skin. The heavy silence in the room deepened, the kind of silence that feels sharp enough to cut. She stepped forward, heels clicking like metronomes against the stone floor, and placed the page into the committee's record with a calmness that made the action feel explosive. It was an invoice, cold, clinical, devastating. $70,000 paid by a struggling liberal arts college in Ohio in exchange for a 45-minute keynote speech by Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Jasmine didn't embellish it. She didn't need to. The figure alone was enough to cause a ripple of shock through the chamber, murmurs darting like insects from one bench to another. On the screen behind her, the details bloomed. Tuition increases, library closures, and yet somehow, tens of thousands redirected for a single speaking fee, dressed in the illusion of honor. Jasmine's eyes didn't leave Sotomayor's face as the figures flashed in cold, impersonal font across the chamber wall. She wasn't just presenting evidence. She was holding up a mirror. But Jasmine was far from finished. With deliberate precision, she produced another document, this time an internal email leaked from the university's chancellor's office. Its subject line chillingly simple: no choice. She read aloud, her voice steady, surgical. We have no choice if we want her to attend. Minimum purchase requirements must be met before confirmation. The words floated over the room like toxic smoke, leaving a taste of something rotten no one could spit out. No spin, no context could dull their blade. It was naked coercion, wrapped in the polite language of institutional desperation. The committee members exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, as if proximity to the evidence itself made them complicit. In the back rows, journalists scribbled furiously, the tapping of keys rising like the first beats of a funeral march. Even from her seat, Sonia Sotomayor could not escape the screen towering behind Jasmine, a screen that no black robe, no judicial decorum could hope to shield against. Slowly, Jasmine closed the folder and placed both hands flat on the table, grounding herself in the gravity of the moment. She didn't lean forward. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she allowed the quiet to stretch until it wrapped itself around every corner of the chamber, until the weight of the unspoken pressed down like a heavy stone on every chest. When she finally spoke, her words were colder than any shout could have been. "Justice Sotomayor," Jasmine said, her tone sharp enough to break bone. "Were you aware that these transactions, these purchases masquerading as honorariums, were taking place in your name?" No one moved. Not a cough. Not a whisper. The only sound was the soft, relentless whir of cameras capturing a moment history would not soon forget. Jasmine held her gaze steady, offering no escape route, no mercy. It was not merely a question, it was an indictment delivered without theatrics, because the evidence had already spoken louder than any accusation ever could. The silence that followed Jasmine's question was a noose tightening around the chamber. And when Sotomayor finally broke it, her answer sliced through the air like a blade dulled by too much evasion. Justice Sotomayor adjusted the microphone in front of her with a delicate, almost reluctant hand, her expression a careful study in restraint. Her voice, when it came, was smooth but distant, as if she were speaking from a ledge high above the courtroom of public opinion. "I do not manage those transactions," she said, the words carefully measured, armored in legal ambiguity. She paused, then added, "My team handles logistics independently. I focus solely on my judicial responsibilities." For a moment, the room seemed to waver between disbelief and grim predictability, as if many had expected this deflection, but still flinched at its cold efficiency. Jasmine Crockett did not move, did not blink. She let the silence grow heavy again, forcing everyone in the room to sit with the hollow echo of that denial. Around them, cameras clicked softly, each flash capturing not revelation, but retreat. Committee members shifted uncomfortably, sensing the old machinery of power grinding into motion. A machine designed to survive scandal, not confess to it. Sotomayor's hands remained perfectly still, folded like a sculpture, while her eyes fixed on some distant, invisible horizon beyond the hearing room. In that moment, it was clear. Her defense was not an explanation. It was an escape. But Jasmine Crockett knew something few others understood. In a room where words could be twisted and truth could be buried, sometimes the deadliest blow was the one delivered in utter, merciless silence. Jasmine did not flinch. She didn't argue, didn't indulge the instinct to tear into the hollow defense laid bare before her. Instead, she moved with a precision that was almost terrifying. A quiet, deliberate motion that seemed to tighten the walls of the hearing room by inches. Without saying a word, she reached into her folder again, fingers brushing over the stiff weight of documentation that had been assembled like a weapon. She selected a single page, thinner than the others but burning with quiet menace, and drew it out with a grace that felt rehearsed for exactly this moment. Then, with the gentlest pressure, she slid the document across the polished oak table toward Sotomayor, the paper whispering against wood so loudly it seemed to snap the already fraying nerves of the room. The page came to rest just inches from the justice's folded hands, and on it, printed in plain black ink, was a financial statement from another university. This one explicitly acknowledging that book purchases had been a de facto requirement for the justice's appearance. Jasmine leaned back slowly, folding her hands in her lap, offering no commentary, no accusation, only the cold inevitability of evidence placed without ceremony before the woman who had once sat beyond reproach. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a living, breathing force, pressing down on every chest in the room like a great, invisible weight. The air inside the chamber thickened until it felt almost unbreathable, every eye locked between the piece of paper and the unreadable mask on Sotomayor's face. Reporters clutched their notepads tighter. Camera operators zoomed in without instruction, drawn to the exquisite brutality of the moment unfolding without a single raised voice. The committee members, veterans of hundreds of hearings, some battle-hardened through scandals and cover-ups, shifted awkwardly in their seats, a collective discomfort so palpable it could almost be heard. Jasmine remained motionless, her gaze heavy but devoid of visible anger, as if daring Sotomayor to contradict what was now undeniable. Not a word had been spoken since the paper had touched the table, but the message screamed louder than any accusation ever could. The evidence was no longer hidden in dense files or buried beneath bureaucratic language. It was here, exposed, naked, and damning. Sotomayor's fingers twitched once, a betrayal of tension she could no longer conceal, but otherwise she remained frozen, her stillness a desperate, crumbling fortress. And yet it didn't matter anymore, because in that silence, under that suffocating light, denial had ceased to be an option. It wasn't Jasmine's voice that condemned her. It was the unbearable clarity of a truth too large to outrun. But just when the silence seemed ready to calcify into something permanent, the real explosion came. Not from Jasmine Crockett, but from somewhere much more unexpected. In the charged stillness of the hearing room, a single hand rose into the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. A congressman from the minority side, his face tight with the kind of grim purpose that signaled a bomb about to be dropped. The chairman gave a small nod, barely a flicker of motion, but it was enough to crack the fragile calm. "Mr. Chairman, I request to introduce new evidence into the record," the congressman said, his voice steady but thick with the weight of what he held. He moved toward the clerk's desk, handing over a printed email, a sheet of paper that looked so ordinary, so harmless, it almost didn't seem capable of carrying the weight it did. But when the clerk placed the email up on the massive display screens, the room collectively leaned forward and then recoiled. At the top, the sender's name was clear: a senior aide to Justice Sotomayor. The message was brutal in its simplicity. Please ensure a minimum purchase of 3,000 units before confirming the justice's appearance. There was no room for interpretation, no ambiguity, no plausible deniability left. The words hit the room like a shockwave, sending reporters scrambling from their seats, tripping over each other as they rushed to blast the headline to a world already breathless with outrage. For the first time since the hearing began, Sotomayor's mask cracked, just slightly but unmistakably. Her shoulders stiffened, and the faintest tremor danced across her jaw, a tiny but fatal betrayal of composure. She blinked once, too slowly, as if processing the inevitable collapse of the narrative she had tried to maintain. Around her, the energy in the room shifted violently. The scent of blood in the water was impossible to miss now. Jasmine Crockett didn't move, didn't smirk, didn't even breathe differently. She simply watched, a living monument to the truth that no robe, no reputation could shield forever. The hearing room, once a stage for careful games and legal fencing, had become something colder, harder, an execution ground paved not with rhetoric, but with facts too brutal to deny. And in that merciless light, even Sonia Sotomayor, once seen as unshakable, looked suddenly, devastatingly human. But power wounded in public view rarely bleeds openly. It fights back, cold and calculating, grasping for the thin shields that once kept it untouchable. Justice Sotomayor adjusted herself with the precision of someone reclaiming lost ground, her spine straightening, her hands folding neatly as if discipline alone could rewrite the moment. She leaned slightly toward the microphone, her movement unhurried, crafted to project steadiness under siege. When her voice emerged, it was low but forceful, the practiced cadence of someone who had spent decades mastering the art of controlled defense. "There is no evidence," she said, her tone crisp, almost clinical, "that I personally requested any purchases related to my speaking engagements." The words hung in the room, polished and stripped of emotion, carefully chosen like chess moves in a match she could no longer afford to lose. She continued, her gaze sweeping the room as if to gather fragments of lingering doubt. "Event logistics, including book acquisitions, were managed independently by the host institutions and their event coordinators. For a few fleeting seconds, the air shifted. A tremor of uncertainty, a flicker of the old reverence trying to reassert itself among some members of the committee. The phrasing was legalistic, neat, just ambiguous enough to leave open a door of plausible deniability. And yet, no matter how carefully the words were laid down, they clashed violently against the stark clarity of the evidence glowing behind her. The email still looming overhead like a silent, irrefutable witness. The reaction was not immediate because it did not need to be. The damage was already carved into the room's foundations. Some committee members, instinctively trained to hear authority and grant it weight, shifted uncomfortably, their pens hesitating midair, their expressions torn between habit and horror. In the press section, reporters froze for a heartbeat. The kind of stillness that comes when a shark smells blood but waits for the victim to realize it. Jasmine Crockett did not move, did not blink, did not react, and in doing so made the hollowness of Sotomayor's defense roar even louder. Her silence was a mirror, throwing the justice's careful words back at her, exposing every crack and contradiction without a single syllable spoken. For all the force of Sotomayor's statement, it could not erase the documents, could not unwrite the directives sent by her own staff, could not unsee the tidal wave of money that had flowed exactly where her appearances demanded it. The strength of her voice only made the fragility of her position more obvious, like shouting into a void that had already swallowed the truth whole. And though she spoke with the authority of her office, the echo that answered her was hollow, brittle, the sound of a fortress already breached from within. But Jasmine Crockett understood something deeper than theatrics. When truth is on your side, you don't have to shout. You simply have to aim and let silence do the bleeding. Jasmine didn't rush, didn't let the adrenaline of the moment distort her control. She moved with a chilling stillness that made every heartbeat in the chamber feel thunderous by comparison. She didn't scramble for the next attack. She let the air grow heavier, let the weight of everything unspoken curl itself around the room, like smoke thick enough to choke on. She shifted one document half an inch to the left, a gesture so minor yet so deliberate that it felt like loading a bullet into a gun in slow motion. Her hands moved with the ease of someone who knew exactly where the center of gravity was and how to pull the floor out from under it. When she finally raised her eyes, they locked onto Sotomayor's with a precision that seemed almost surgical, stripping away the layers of ceremony and title until only one flawed human being remained exposed beneath the glare of judgment. Her voice, when it came, was almost soft, but every word landed like a hammer, driving iron into stone. "Madam Justice," she said, pausing just long enough for the formal title to sting with irony, "have you ever, even once, asked yourself why these institutions felt compelled to pay such extraordinary sums merely for the privilege of your presence?" The question wasn't shouted, wasn't sharpened with rage, it was sharpened with disappointment, a blade dipped in cold, undeniable reality. Jasmine let the words hang there, heavy and merciless, before delivering the second blow, softer still, but twice as deadly. Or did you simply believe that justice itself was something to be traded, like a commodity at an open-air market? The chamber didn't so much react as it braced, as if every person present understood instinctively that no grand speech, no polished denial could fully shield Sotomayor from what had just been laid bare. The room held its breath, suspended between the crumbling facade of authority and the unrelenting force of a question too raw, too brutal to deflect. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush. She let the weight of her last words linger, let them settle into the bones of the chamber like a cold front swallowing a city whole. She could feel it, the moment when every eye turned not just toward her, but toward the truth hanging uncomfortably between them all. The sound of papers rustling had stopped. The reporters at the back had gone still, their pens hovering midair, their recorders blinking in silence. Even the cameras, those merciless predators of public failure, seemed to lean in closer, hungry for what might come next. Jasmine inhaled slowly, the motion deliberate and unhurried, grounding herself not in rage but in something far more dangerous: certainty. She straightened her spine, shifted her weight just slightly, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was low, almost intimate, but it rolled through the room with the force of an approaching storm. If justice, she said, each syllable cutting through the air like a chisel against stone, can be bought with a bulk order of books, then what justice is left for those who cannot afford to purchase your presence? She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She simply delivered the question into the heart of the room and let it detonate in silence. The seconds that followed stretched out mercilessly, each one a blade twisting deeper into the collective consciousness of everyone present. 1 second, 2, 5. The tick of the overhead clock sounded like gunshots in the stillness, marking time not as progress, but as judgment. No one spoke. No one shifted. It was as if the very oxygen had been sucked from the hearing room, leaving only a vacuum filled with the inescapable echo of what had just been asked. Jasmine didn't move. Her gaze remained locked, unwavering, into the eyes of Sonia Sotomayor. Not with hatred, not even with triumph, but with something colder, something purer, a demand for truth that could not be sidestepped. The justice for all her decades of experience, for all the battles she had fought and won, sat frozen. Her face, usually so adept at controlling nuance and message, betrayed her now with its stillness. There was no flicker of righteous indignation, no clever retort forming at the corners of her mouth. There was only absence, an empty space where answers should have been. The reporters began exchanging glances, not frantic, but slow, heavy. The kind of looks shared among witnesses to a historical moment they knew they would spend years trying to explain. The committee members themselves were statues, some gripping their pens so tightly their knuckles whitened, others simply staring, their political instincts, honed through years of hearings and scandals, failing them completely now. Jasmine could feel it without needing to look. The shift, the slow tidal pull of narrative, snapping free from tradition, free from titles, free from the old reflex to protect power. In this room, in this second, only the naked facts remained. Only the merciless, unvarnished reality. If justice could be bought, then justice had already died. Not with a bang, but with an invoice. Sotomayor opened her mouth once, as if to speak, but no words came. She closed it again, her throat working against a silence too heavy to swallow. Her hands, once so carefully still, now twitched at the edges. Micro movements that betrayed the battle raging just beneath the polished surface. She looked for the first time in her long and storied career, not like a titan of jurisprudence, but like what she had become in this moment. A human being confronted by a truth too massive, too damning to escape. Jasmine didn't press her advantage. She didn't need to. Every second that passed became a verdict louder than any gavel strike, a judgment more final than any committee vote. And still, Sotomayor said nothing. Not a protest, not a denial, not even a plea for understanding. Outside the hearing room, the world was already beginning to move. Notifications exploded across news networks. Twitter and cable channels flooded with breaking alerts. Justice for sale. No one above the law. But inside, time had slowed to a suffocating crawl, trapping everyone in a moment that would never truly end for those who had witnessed it. Jasmine remained still, her silence as lethal as any argument could have been, her presence a living reminder that sometimes the most powerful victory comes not from speaking louder, but from being willing to stand, to ask the question no one else dared, and to endure the terrible silence that follows. And Sonia Sotomayor, the once unshakable titan of the nation's highest court, sat motionless, caught in that silence, unable or unwilling to find her way back to the illusion of innocence she had once worn like armor. The silence inside the hearing chamber had barely lifted when a new kind of storm began to gather, one that no amount of silence or stature could hold back anymore. Even before Sotomayor could summon a defense, even before the weight of Jasmine's unanswered question had fully drained from the chamber walls, the machinery of consequence had already begun to move. Staffers whispered urgently behind raised folders. Committee members leaned toward one another in tight clusters, exchanging nods, quick looks, grim resolutions. In the far corner of the room, a gavel struck once, sharp and decisive, as Chairman Reynolds cleared his throat and rose to his feet, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Without flourish, without the grandstanding that usually accompanied such moments, he read from a pre-prepared document, a resolution that had been drafted in the event that things spiraled exactly as they just had. Due to substantial concerns regarding potential ethical violations, he intoned, his voice echoing off the marble like a funeral bell, the committee hereby moves to open an independent investigation into the conduct of Justice Sonia Sotomayor. There was no outcry, no applause, just a dense, leaden silence as reality sunk its claws deep into the foundation of the Capitol itself. The vote was procedural, almost bloodless in its efficiency, but no one present was fooled by the mechanical precision of it. It was not just a vote, it was a tectonic shift, a rare tearing of the fabric that had long been used to shield those perched atop the nation's highest institutions. Member after member cast their ballots, their faces tight, their voices subdued but unwavering. Some looked genuinely sorrowful, others seemed almost relieved, as if finally permitted to acknowledge the rot they had long suspected but dared not name. The final tally was displayed not with fanfare, but with a cold digital beep that seemed to vibrate in the bones. Yes, 34. Nays, 5. An overwhelming majority, an undeniable mandate. And with that, the process was set into brutal, irreversible motion. Outside the chamber, the world responded like dry brush set to flame. News outlets broke the story within seconds, their alerts flashing across the bottom of TV screens and phones like urgent distress signals. Across social media, hashtags multiplied and mutated. Sotomayor investigation. Justice on trial. Broken bench. Protesters who had been shouting in vague anger now had a target sharper than any slogan. And support for Jasmine Crockett's quiet, relentless stand surged like a tide breaking through a crumbling seawall. In coffee shops, offices, and classrooms across the country, Americans who had once believed the Supreme Court stood untouchable now found themselves grappling with a far darker, far more human reality. If even here and even now, justice could be bought and sold, what hope remained for the powerless? Back inside the Capitol, Jasmine remained seated at the witness table, her posture unbroken, her face unreadable. She did not celebrate. She did not gloat. The gravity of what had just happened weighed too heavily for victory dances or applause. This was not a triumph. It was a reckoning, the kind of reckoning that left scars deep beneath the skin of a nation. Across the room, Sotomayor sat in silence, her hands folded tightly together, her face an impassive mask that no longer fooled anyone. She was still cloaked in the black robe of her office, but its symbolism had been gutted, its armor pierced beyond repair by the very system she had once been sworn to protect. Jasmine's gaze met hers once more, not with hatred, but with something even harder to bear, disappointment, deep and unrelenting, carved into the very air between them. The formal announcement of the investigation came within minutes, broadcast live across every network, framed against the imposing marble columns of the Capitol steps. The language was crisp, sterile, the kind designed to minimize panic, but nothing could disguise the historical gravity of it. For the first time in living memory, a sitting Supreme Court justice would be subjected to an independent inquiry for financial misconduct. The implications rattled across the judiciary like a distant earthquake. Subtle at first, then undeniable. Clerks, aides, even junior judges began whispering in back hallways and private offices about what it meant, what it might unleash. The myth of untouchability had been shattered, and no one, no matter how high their station, could pretend otherwise. And as dusk fell over Washington, casting long shadows across the Capitol grounds, the cameras remained, silent, unblinking witnesses to the beginning of a battle that would stretch far beyond these first trembling steps. Jasmine Crockett walked out of the hearing room without fanfare, her steps steady, her hands empty, her face unadorned by victory. She had not come to win a headline. She had come for something far more dangerous, to demand that the promises carved into the stones of the Supreme Court, equal justice under law, be more than just empty words. Behind her, the doors of the chamber swung closed with a soft but final thud, sealing inside them a truth that could no longer be hidden, a truth now marching forward, relentless and unsparing, into the light. As the Capitol doors closed behind Jasmine Crockett, the real war began. Not inside courtrooms or committee rooms, but across the nation's living rooms, television screens, and the endless battlegrounds of public opinion. Within hours, the media machine roared to life, faster and hungrier than even seasoned observers could remember. Cable news anchors interrupted regular programming with flashing banners reading "Breaking Supreme Court Crisis." Talking heads scrambled into hastily arranged panels under headlines like "The Fall of Public Trust" and "Can the Court Survive?" CNN aired somber graphics of the Supreme Court building cracked down the middle. Fox News deployed fiery montages of Jasmine Crockett and Sonia Sotomayor in split-screen standoffs, set to ominous music. MSNBC pulled in constitutional scholars, historians, ethicists, each guest more alarmed than the last, to dissect what the crisis meant not just for one justice, but for the credibility of the entire American judicial system. In studios flooded with cold blue lighting, anchors leaned forward in their chairs, speaking in the grave, clipped tones usually reserved for wars, natural disasters, or the death of a president. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was an existential reckoning. The early debates were cautious, even respectful, but by nightfall, the gloves had come off. Some commentators tried to draw historical parallels. Watergate, the Iran-Contra scandal. But those analogies collapsed quickly under the sheer weight of what was unfolding. This wasn't about political corruption. This wasn't about an abuse of executive power. This was the rot at the very heart of the institution, tasked with safeguarding justice itself. Across news desks and podcasts and Twitter live streams, one brutal phrase began to surface again and again, a drumbeat impossible to ignore: crisis of legitimacy. Night after night, the phrase bled into headlines, burned across tickers, and echoed from the mouths of former judges and legal scholars who, for decades, had sworn an almost religious reverence for the Supreme Court's independence. Now they spoke with the haunted tone of people watching a cathedral collapse into rubble. In a tense, hastily organized special on PBS, a panel of retired justices sat in a semicircle, their faces pale and drawn. Justice Hernandez, once a fierce defender of judicial neutrality, stared into the camera and said simply, "When trust dies, the law follows." On a rival network, a fiery roundtable descended into open shouting, with pundits accusing each other of enabling the myth of untouchability that had allowed rot to flourish unchecked. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's cold, surgical questioning played on an endless loop, each replay magnifying her words into rallying cries and funeral bells. Viewers weren't just consuming news, they were participating in a national mourning, a slow, sickening realization that an institution thought to be sacred had revealed itself as deeply, mortally flawed. On social media, the reaction was volcanic. Twitter threads analyzing every line of Sotomayor's failed defense went viral in hours. TikTok exploded with stitched videos of young law students breaking down the implications between memes and tears. YouTube streamed emergency town halls where constitutional experts fielded panicked questions from ordinary citizens. If we can't trust the court, what do we have left? The gravity of the moment was not confined to one demographic, one party, or even one generation. It bled into every corner of the American psyche. Middle-aged men in sports bars, grandmothers on front porches, teenagers in debate clubs, all suddenly found themselves grappling with the unthinkable. The idea that justice was not a birthright, not an unshakable pillar, but a fragile agreement held together only by faith. And faith, once broken, was almost impossible to repair. Meanwhile, Congress scrambled to control the narrative, issuing solemn statements affirming their continued respect for judicial independence, while also emphasizing the need for full transparency and accountability. The contradictions in their words were glaring, an open wound that the media picked at with gleeful brutality. Night after night, networks ran split-screen timelines showing how many millions had allegedly flowed through Sotomayor's speaking circuits. juxtaposed against grainy footage of her swearing the judicial oath to uphold the Constitution without fear or favor. The hypocrisy was too glaring, too fresh, too raw to be explained away by procedural language or partisan talking points. Trust had not just cracked, it had imploded. By the end of the week, new polls showed a seismic shift. Confidence in the Supreme Court had plummeted to historic lows. For the first time in American history, a majority of citizens, across party lines, said they believed the court was politically compromised beyond repair. Editorial boards from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal called for sweeping reforms, term limits for justices, mandatory disclosure of financial relationships, even, in hushed tones, the unthinkable idea of impeachment proceedings. The court, once cloaked in the solemnity of marble and tradition, now stood naked before a furious, grieving nation. And no black robe, no Latin motto, no centuries-old ceremony could shield it from the storm that Jasmine Crockett's quiet question had unleashed. Meanwhile, as the media's frenzy burned hotter by the hour, Jasmine herself refused interviews. She declined cable hits, podcast invites, even the most prestigious Sunday shows. She simply returned to her district, resumed her work, and let the evidence, and the silence that followed it, do what no amount of political theater ever could. She knew better than anyone that once faith breaks, no speech can rebuild it. Only truth could. And truth, finally, was marching without apology through a nation that could no longer afford illusions. The fallout from the Capitol hearings had not yet fully settled before another earthquake rocked Washington. The White House announced a press conference. It was scheduled for noon, a hurried time that suggested urgency rather than strategy. In the hours leading up to it, reporters filled the West Wing press room like a rising tide, their whispers sharp and slicing through the heavy air. No one quite knew what the president would say. Every official statement so far had been cold, mechanical, designed to buy time rather than provide leadership. But now, with confidence in the Supreme Court collapsing and protests spilling into city squares across the country, silence was no longer an option. The nation needed reassurance, or at least the illusion of it. And so the president, reluctant, cornered, but calculating, prepared to step into a storm more dangerous than any foreign enemy could ever summon. The press conference room buzzed under the hum of hot lights and the restless energy of networks scrambling for primetime positioning. Aides moved along the perimeter of the room like field medics, adjusting podium notes, whispering last-minute strategies that no one fully believed in anymore. When the president finally entered, brisk, jaw set, the weight of history visible on his face, the room snapped into a brittle, expectant silence. Cameras clicked in a staccato rhythm as he took his place behind the podium, gripping its edges as if to anchor himself against the storm. For a long, agonizing second, he simply stood there, surveying the crowd, letting the silence stretch until it bordered on cruelty. Then he spoke, and his voice, though steady, carried a tension that betrayed the cost of every syllable. "No one," he said, pausing just long enough for the gravity of the words to settle. "No one is above the law, not even those entrusted with interpreting it." It was the kind of statement that was meant to be obvious, patriotic, but now it sounded almost revolutionary. The speech itself was a masterpiece of careful threading. The president expressed deep respect for the independence of the judiciary, profound concern for the erosion of public trust, and an urgent commitment to transparency and accountability. He never mentioned Sonia Sotomayor by name, a decision that only fueled speculation. His handlers believed that naming her directly would pour gasoline on an already raging fire. But outside the polished walls of the White House, no such discretion existed. News banners ran bold and relentless. President addresses Supreme Court crisis. Across social media, screenshots of his grim face and clenched fists circulated like wartime propaganda. Pundits pounced, analyzing his body language, his hesitations, even the way his eyes seemed to flicker with something dangerously close to fear. The message was clear, even if the words were not. The White House was no longer in control of the narrative. The nation's faith in its highest institutions was slipping, and with it, the bedrock of American democracy. Inside the Oval Office, the divisions were even more brutal. In closed-door meetings that leaked within minutes to major newspapers, The president's advisors tore into each other. One camp argued that protecting the court's legitimacy, even at the cost of shielding Sotomayor, was essential to preventing constitutional chaos. If the court falls, everything falls, one senior aide reportedly screamed, slamming a fist on the long mahogany conference table. The other camp, younger, angrier, and riding the wave of public fury, argued the opposite, that real loyalty to the Constitution demanded confrontation, demanded rooting out corruption, no matter how painful. "We cannot save the court by lying to the American people," a junior counsel snapped, her voice cracking with the strain of suppressed rage. Between these camps, the president sat silent, the decision coiling tighter around him like a noose. Every choice pointed toward disaster. Every hesitation made the fall steeper. Meanwhile, protests outside the White House swelled beyond anything the Secret Service had anticipated. What had started as scattered demonstrations had evolved into a sprawling sea of voices. Young, old, conservative, liberal. Unified in a fury that no speech could calm. Hand-painted signs read, "Is justice for sale? No more gods in robes. Truth over tradition." The chants echoed through the night like war drums, a relentless reminder that the anger outside could not be caged by security barriers or press releases. Inside, advisors updated threat assessments by the hour, warning that public trust was reaching a breaking point unseen since the days of Nixon's resignation. And still, Jasmine Crockett remained silent, giving no interviews, issuing no statements. Her absence on the media stage only made her figure larger, more mythic, as if her silence itself had become a form of leadership the nation craved and the White House feared. Behind the scenes, speechwriters and political strategists crafted drafts for an address that might become the most important of the president's career, a primetime Oval Office address to the nation. There were versions that called for sweeping judicial reforms, versions that promised a special commission to restore integrity, versions that hinted ever so cautiously at the necessity of new guardrails, term limits, financial disclosures, maybe even impeachment if the facts demanded it. Each draft, however, carried its own risks. The president understood that every word would be a stone thrown into a fragile pond already churning with rage. And what if, whispered late at night, never recorded, only half-spoken, what if no speech could fix what had already broken? Across the networks, countdown clocks began to appear. President to address the nation, live in 24 hours. In bars and cafes and living rooms across America, people canceled dinner plans and scheduled watch parties not out of celebration, but out of the terrible recognition that history was tilting again, and no one knew if it would land upright. Editorials sharpened into knives. Some demanded that Sotomayor resign to save the court's dignity. Others warned that forcing her out would weaponize public anger against the entire government itself. Historians debated in clipped, urgent tones about whether this moment was more dangerous than the 1974 constitutional crisis, and many concluded grimly that it was. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett's question, asked in that silent, suffocating hearing room, echoed louder than any speech or op-ed could. If justice can be bought, what remains for those who cannot pay? It was no longer a question aimed at one woman. It was a question aimed at the soul of a nation, and it demanded an answer that no one, not even the president, was ready to give. Even as the White House scrambled to contain the national crisis, a quieter, more personal battle was brewing, one that no press conference could deflect and no speech could silence. Jasmine Crockett, the woman who had asked the question that shattered the marble image of the Supreme Court, found herself thrust into the brutal glare of a country desperate for heroes, and just as desperate for scapegoats. Overnight, she became both. Major networks flooded her congressional office with interview requests, book agents circled like sharks sensing blood, advocacy groups begged her to headline rallies across the country. But Jasmine answered none of them. She stayed silent, working late nights behind closed doors, refusing to cash in on the firestorm she had lit. Her staff, young and fiercely loyal, fielded the endless calls and threats with the grim efficiency of a campaign headquarters under siege. But the storm was not just metaphorical. One morning, arriving at her district office just after sunrise, Jasmine found the front window shattered, glass sparkling like a crime scene beneath the weak Texas sun. Spray painted across the exposed brick were three words, black and jagged: "Stay silent." Local police arrived within minutes, their presence more symbolic than effective, already knowing what Jasmine herself knew. This was not random vandalism. This was a message, a warning. And yet, even as her aides begged her to increase security, to hire private protection, to consider a temporary relocation, Jasmine refused. She would not run from a fight she hadn't started. She would not hide from the truth she had demanded. If anything, the attack only hardened her resolve, rooting her even deeper into the storm she had stirred. Across social media, support and vitriol came in equal measure, tidal waves colliding against each other with no hope of reconciliation. On Twitter, the hashtag #StandWithJasmine trended for 72 straight hours, buoyed by celebrities, activists, and ordinary citizens who saw in her a reflection of their own longing for courage and truth. But so too did darker corners of the internet swell with rage. Conspiracies painted her as a puppet, an opportunist, even a traitor. Fake news sites published doctored images showing Jasmine in meetings with political enemies. Fringe commentators accused her of orchestrating the entire scandal for personal gain. The threats grew more specific. Anonymous emails described the layout of her home, the names of her nieces and nephews, the routes she usually took to work. Her chief of staff, a veteran of 3 presidential campaigns, confessed quietly one night, "I've never seen anything like this, not even close." Meanwhile, across the country, a grassroots movement she never intended to lead began to bloom like wildflowers after a fire. Students at universities held candlelight vigils in her name, reading passages from the Constitution under darkening skies. Protesters gathered outside courthouses, holding up hand-painted signs with her face beneath the words, "Justice without fear." Community leaders invoked her story at town halls and city council meetings, framing her not just as a whistleblower, but as the conscience the country had forgotten it needed. Some called for her to run for Senate. Some whispered of bigger dreams, dreams that frightened Jasmine more than any threat could. Inside the halls of power, Jasmine's newfound prominence was met with a very different reaction. Senior members of her own party, the same people who had once dismissed her as too young, too radical, too disruptive, now treated her like a loaded weapon left unsecured in a crowded room. Invitations to fundraisers dried up. Allies avoided public photographs. Whisper campaigns questioned her loyalty, her judgment, even her mental fitness. A senior senator was overheard grumbling at a private luncheon. "She doesn't understand. You don't burn the whole institution down just because one judge is corrupt." But Jasmine understood perfectly. She understood that the institution was already burning. It just hadn't admitted it yet. And in the quiet moments when the shouting and the threats and the headlines faded into the background, Jasmine wrestled with the loneliest battle of all, the knowledge that telling the truth had made her a target not just for her enemies, but for those who claimed to stand for the same principles she fought to defend. Some nights she lay awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of invisible crosshairs pressing against her chest. Other nights she found strength in the letters that poured into her office. Handwritten notes from grandmothers in Georgia, high school students in Oregon, retired veterans in Pennsylvania. They all said some version of the same thing. "You spoke when no one else would. You stood when others hid. Don't stop now." By the 3rd week after the hearing, the pressure reached a breaking point. Major newspapers ran editorials demanding Jasmine clarify her position, a thinly veiled call for her to apologize, to soften, to reassure the powerful that she wasn't going to bring down the entire system. Cable news hosts suggested she had overstepped by questioning a sitting justice so directly. Political consultants whispered advice into every available ear. Distance yourself, pivot, change the subject. Jasmine heard it all. She listened, and then she made her decision. She would not apologize. She would not pivot. She would not change the subject. If the price of demanding justice was isolation, was danger, was the loss of political protection, so be it. Jasmine Crockett had asked a question the nation could no longer unhear. And now, no matter the cost, she intended to see it answered. While the nation seethed and the White House fought for survival, inside the marble sanctum of the Supreme Court, an even quieter and more perilous battle was unfolding. For decades, the court had prided itself on a wall of silence. No leaks, no public dissent, only the cold dignity of unsigned majority opinions and solemn robes. But now that wall was starting to crack. Whispers echoed through the marble halls like ghosts, moving from clerk to clerk, from chamber to chamber. Some justices, furious at what Sotomayor's scandal had unleashed, began holding private meetings without her, discussing the unthinkable. Public statements, letters of censure, even coordinated demands for her resignation. The court, long imagined by the public as a monolith of order, was splintering under the weight of betrayal. And the cracks were growing wider every day. The first tremor came when a single anonymous memo leaked to the Washington Post. Carefully worded but unmistakable in its intent, the memo described deep concerns within the court about recent developments and called for swift internal review to protect the institution's integrity. No names were attached, no direct accusations were made, but the meaning was clear to anyone who could read between the lines. The court itself no longer trusted one of its own. Within hours, cable news hosts flashed screenshots of the memo across screens nationwide. Analysts dissected every word, every comma, every awkward phrasing, searching for clues about who inside the court had finally broken the sacred code of silence. Behind the scenes, the divisions deepened. Some justices argued that a unified front was essential, that any public fracture would do more damage than even Sotomayor's scandal. Others insisted that silence was complicity, that the court's legitimacy could only be saved by confronting the rot openly. Heated arguments spilled out of private conferences, bleeding into public sightings of justices hurrying past reporters with unusually grim faces. Chief Justice Bennett, a man known for his obsession with preserving institutional dignity, reportedly told a confidant, "We are not merely guardians of the law, we are guardians of trust, and trust, once shattered, cannot be ordered back into place like soldiers on a parade ground." Meanwhile, pressure mounted from outside. Legal scholars, retired judges, and even sitting federal appellate justices issued open letters demanding transparency and accountability. Law students at prestigious universities staged walkouts during lectures on constitutional law, refusing to sit silently while the ideals they studied crumbled in real time. A nationwide poll showed that 68% of Americans, an unprecedented number, now supported term limits for Supreme Court justices. Faith in the court had not merely been shaken, it had collapsed into a crater from which no simple apology could rebuild. In chambers, the tension was so thick it distorted daily operations. Clerks, once tasked with researching obscure legal precedents, now found themselves navigating minefields of internal politics, careful never to be seen speaking too long with the wrong justice. Security around the justices quietly increased. Anonymous threats and protests outside their private residences forced U.S. Marshals to step up patrols. Yet even with added protection, the real threat wasn't physical, it was existential. The Supreme Court, once the nation's final word on justice, was now seen by many as just another arena of corrupted power, another empire hollowed out from within. Then came the internal petition, an extraordinary, almost surreal document quietly circulated among the justices and their senior clerks. It was a plea, blunt and unmistakable, that Justice Sonia Sotomayor voluntarily step away from hearing cases until the independent investigation concluded. It was not an official censure. It was not a demand for resignation, but it was a signal so loud it could not be ignored. Some signed reluctantly, their loyalty to the institution outweighing their personal affection. Others signed with shaking hands, aware that history would remember this moment long after the headlines faded. A few refused, clinging to the old rules of secrecy and solidarity, but they were in the minority. The court was cracking, and no oath of collegiality could hold it together anymore. Word of the petition, of course, leaked within hours. Everything leaked now. The New York Times published a bombshell piece quoting unnamed court insiders describing unprecedented levels of mistrust, and an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and despair. One former justice, speaking off record, summarized it with brutal simplicity. The court is no longer nine. It's every man and woman for themselves. Sotomayor, for her part, remained silent. No statements, no interviews. Her chambers issued a terse, lawyerly press release reiterating her innocence and pledging full cooperation with the investigation. But inside the building, her isolation was absolute. Colleagues who once exchanged holiday cards and family updates with her now barely met her gaze. In the court's private dining room, her usual seat at the long mahogany table sat empty day after day, a ghost at a feast no one dared acknowledge. The woman who once commanded standing ovations at law schools and civil rights conferences now moved through the court's halls like a shadow, visible, unavoidable, but untouchable in a way that spoke more of shame than of power. Outside, protests grew louder. "Resign!" chants rang out from the Supreme Court steps, carried on the cold spring wind. Legal organizations once proud to feature Sotomayor at their annual galas quietly removed her portraits from programs and websites. Editorial boards shifted from cautious concern to outright condemnation. The calls for reform, real, structural reform, could no longer be dismissed as fringe hysteria. They had moved into the mainstream, carried there by the fury of a nation that had seen behind the black curtain and could no longer pretend to believe in the myths it once held sacred. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She gave no interviews, appeared on no panels, made no victory laps. She simply kept working, methodically, quietly, as if the entire nation's upheaval were not swirling around her name. In her silence, she had become something larger than any pundit or politician could manufacture. A reminder that sometimes it only takes one person to ask the right question at the right time, and that the answers, once demanded, can shake the very pillars of a nation to their core. Even as the world moved on, spinning new headlines and chasing new scandals, the true lesson of that long, brutal confrontation refused to fade. At its core, the scandal was never just about one justice's fall from grace. It was about the thin, fragile line between power and principle. Jasmine Crockett's question had forced an entire nation to stare into a mirror it had spent decades avoiding. She showed that real justice isn't safeguarded by marble columns or flowing robes. It's safeguarded by the willingness of ordinary people to demand extraordinary accountability. Her refusal to flinch in the face of power exposed a deeper, uglier truth: that corruption rarely begins with monstrous acts. It begins with small compromises, whispered justifications, and the slow, silent death of outrage. In a system built on trust, silence becomes complicity faster than anyone dares admit. Jasmine reminded a fractured country that truth is not always loud, but it is always heavy. Heavy enough to break centuries-old myths if only someone is willing to carry it. She didn't do it with anger. She did it with the quiet, relentless certainty that courage sometimes looks less like battle cries and more like standing still when the world demands you kneel. The real crisis was not about whether Sonia Sotomayor stayed or resigned. The real crisis was about whether Americans still believed that justice was something sacred or merely something for sale. Jasmine's silence in the aftermath was as powerful as her voice had been inside that hearing room. She understood that victories measured in headlines are fleeting, but victories measured in restored conscience leave marks that last for generations. Her example became a quiet blueprint for anyone who has ever faced an impossible choice between comfort and truth. She proved that one question, asked at the right moment by the right voice, can tear open the sky, and she reminded everyone watching that the measure of a nation is not found in how it celebrates its heroes, but in how it listens to those brave enough to call out its failures. In a world that rewards conformity and punishes defiance, Jasmine Crockett chose to tell the truth. And that choice, simple, terrible, beautiful, changed everything. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.